So a quick agenda slide, which we'll skip on from because you've seen it now. And split into 3 parts. You got me for 90 minutes, the joy. And the first part is, we did something very similar when Richard and I started first working with Sentinel around how partners should actually provide a managed service based around Sentinel as well. So we've taken that work and we've sort of reshaped it for the IoT space. And we've got some ideas. So there is a question panel within Teams. So if you don't agree with what we're saying, then please do voice an opinion through that. And one of us can read out, of course, your questions to add to that little discussion. But to build into there, let's get there first, as it were. And we've got some principles, of course, which I think Richard's covered quite nicely, but to try and get them onto a very succinct context for the next couple of slides, we are looking at Defender for IoT. So we are aware there's an entire Azure IoT infrastructure and platform as well. We'll probably get there eventually, as in months, not today. But the focus for the very moment, at least, is Defender for IoT. And that, of course, is the acquisition we made last summer. So it's still relatively new to us. It came part of our selling motion towards the end of January this year. So it's just coming up, actually, for its 9th month birthday, I think, if that's such a thing. However, we're not talking about it in isolation either. So it does feed into the other sort of products within our security ecosystem as well. So some terms you'll hear mentioned and some symbols you may well see, of course, is around Sentinel and Microsoft 365 Defender. Now, Microsoft 365 Defender is an entire suite of products. The one we're actually interested in is MDE, so Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And we'll come on to why that is in a few slides' time as well. On top of that, well, some of this is just nice to know, I guess, already. So IoT Hub is the way we pipe information from the sensors on premise into the cloud. And even that's a whole discussion, of course, in its own right. And then the security center there sits on top of something called Log Analytics, where a lot of the alerts are actually registered. We won't touch on that so much today, where the alerting platform for us is going to be heavily focused around Sentinel as we move forward. And what do we actually mean? Now, each of us, you probably noticed, are trying to define what OT, IoT, EIT, whatever acronym you fancy using, and what device types they actually cover as well. So this is a slightly different take, and split them out into those 6 different verticals, of course, around where we're starting to classify device types, whether they're sort of traditional or dedicated IoT style devices, where you can't touch them. There is no operating system available to us. We can't go and patch it. We can't install a nice agent upon it. Although other IoT devices, of course, we can. We have our own little operating systems and firmware to do that if needed. But obviously for today, Defender for IoT, that's where those sit. And we gradually go up the scale from left to right on this particular slide as and when we get to endpoints, of course, which is your, well, in Microsoft language, of course, soon to be the Windows 11 very rich laptops and desktops, etc. as well. And then if we overlay some products on this instead, you start getting an idea of where we're actually starting to focus. So very right-hand side, MDE, if you're not aware of another acronym, that's Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. If you're aware of the old name, it was Defender ATP. It's been rebranded quite a while ago now, actually, about a year ago, into the family of Microsoft 365 Defender. And then we have Enterprise IoT, which is perhaps some of the more things like printers and access points and other areas of that as we work our way down into some of the agentless monitoring. And then, of course, where something's built on something like Azure Sphere, for example, where it's got one of our real-time operating systems as part of the actual hardware build as well. We're concentrating pretty much in this middle space. We're going to stray into enterprise a little bit. We did tease on the agenda with the word enterprise as well. Turns out we got slightly ahead of ourselves from a timing perspective. So enterprise is on the roadmap from our perspective. It's likely to be early next year-ish, I'd imagine, at the moment. There's no set dates at all. This is just a feeling from the rumours we hear internally. But you'll get a sense of how that's coming about and the journey is on how to get there as we progress through the next few slides. So we will be talking MDE, and obviously we're going to cover device discovery in particular for an MDE, because that's an important integration into the story we're talking through today. And then, of course, a lot of it will be around this OT ICS space in the agentless monitoring. And I think Richard's touched on this as well, but I'll touch on it as well. The solution at the moment is almost always completely passive. So we don't send any packets out onto the network to do discovery when we talk about the Defender for IoT sensor. The whole area that we cover today is completely passive. Now, there is a small lie in there, as in you can set up some SMTP strings to go and interrogate some network devices. And if you're feeling really brave, you can construct some WMI inquiries to go off and query, obviously, Windows servers if you really wanted to. But out the box, with none of that configuration, then it is completely passive. And we highlight this because it means you can put it into production. So now, admittedly, there is a change on the switch, of course, because we need some sort of port spanning to get the packets fed into the sensor. But apart from that, sometimes relatively minor change, the whole approach is very passive. So if you are looking at customer opportunities, they've asked you to come in, maybe have a look at their network for a week to see what kind of data you can get to prove the value of Defender for IoT. And it is a very passive approach that allows that to happen. And we have some other ideas. And so do some of our partners. So do Richard and I, as we talk about architectures for sort of managed service providers in the IoT space as well. And this is where we're probably going to spend the next 20 minutes, actually, is on this particular slide. This one, that is. And we'll go through some of our ideas on here on how we think partners might like to work, and some of the direction perhaps that we're starting to give partners now when they talk to us about how to roll out a proof of concept or a pilot or some sort of demo environment either as well. There has been some questions already about demo environments in the chat. There is no easy answer just yet. I'll give you the official answer, I'll give you the incoming answer, and then I'll give you some rumour mill answer for a couple of months' time as well. Currently, of course, the minimum price to run Defender for IoT is $2,000 a month. It's quite a big pill to swallow in reality, because none of us are going to be demoing with 2,000 devices, of course. So it's it's 1,000 devices, and it's $2 per device, hence the $2,000 charge. But none of us are going to be demoing with 1,000 devices, I'd imagine. So it's a bit overkill for what we need for proof of concepts, perhaps, or for demonstrations, both internally to get trained up on the product and for when we're actually demonstrating to customers as well. Now, that doesn't happen for 30 days. So there is a 30-day grace period. And that is with any new subscription, and a tenant, of course, can hold multiple subscriptions. Every time you create a new subscription and then put Defender for IoT into that subscription, then you get a free trial essentially for 30 days. And you get that 1,000 device limit trial for that 30 days. The warning, though, as Richard and I have found out on a couple of our test tenants we use internally, is pretty much on day 30, because remember there's always time zones involved as well, you will get a nice $2,000 charge applied automatically. And if you don't have enough credit, which we never do in Microsoft, then it instantly kills off your tenant, and you have to wait a month before you can actually reactivate it again and get that particular charge switched off. So be warned, if you are managing it as a sort of 30-day free trial, make sure you set something in your calendar or something similar to make sure you remember to actually switch it off before the automatic charge starts to occur. Now, there is a cheeky element you can do during this 30 days. So part of the IoT subscription gives you access to the sensor files. So there's a big ISO file you can download, and that allows you to build out the sensors, and you need to license the sensors as well. Now, those licenses will last quite a long time, normally a lot longer than a month, for example. And so that allows you to get hold of some of those ISOs, download them, and perhaps put them onto some sort of hypervisor on your laptop, perhaps. And we'll come to this idea in a moment. And then once the 30-day trial expires, you can carry on using these sensors for quite some time. It's at least 6 months, I think, from memory. And by then, of course, we'll have something else running, so that should be long enough. And that gives you time then to play around, or for demo, for learning, for training, just in a play pit example, to get some experience of using, of course, Defender for IoT. Now, as Frank mentioned, if you missed it, one of his final slides, from next month, that minimum charge is going to drop to $1,400. So 30% saving. Nice, but not fantastic. There is rumours, and this is where we get to rumour mill stage, that the minimum device count will shrink down remarkably as well. So we've certainly asked for quite a low number. My suspicion it'll be probably 500, maybe below if we get lucky. That coupled with the recent price change, of course, means it's a lot more palatable to be running a real tenant. There are no free tenants or free IoT subscriptions. It's not like the Microsoft 365 world where we can give out sort of an M365 subscription license for a year, like we do on demos at Microsoft.com. Either the product group haven't quite got around to that yet, or it's simply too difficult, I'd imagine, under the covers to achieve in some cases. So at the moment, we are stuck with this particular approach. Although, of course, if you've used your free trial, 30-day period, then you can get hold of that ISO file, and then you can start playing with the ISO file, as hopefully will show. So in this particular slide, as you can see, we've got some sort of factory environment. Who knows what it is? I was just building out icons as I saw them as I was flicking through the little image gallery. So we've got hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of IoT devices sat down here, and they're probably connected to, obviously, well, depending how many sites these devices exist within, they'll be connected to a number of network switches. On those switches, depending, of course, which manufacturer you use, spam port seems to be a reasonably familiar term, where we try and mirror the packets, and then things can start getting interesting for us. So you will need some configuration in your switch to enable this if it hasn't been enabled already. The nice thing we have found, because I used to work with switches a lot in the past, is the actual bandwidth of network packets coming out of these devices is not always that huge. So if you've had experience with spam ports before, or port mirroring, whatever you want to call it, then switches have the tendency to best effort. So they'll replicate the traffic until it gets to about 70%, and then they'll start dropping packets depending on how busy the switch is. Because again, this isn't IT world, this is OT world. Typically those bandwidths aren't quite so high, so the switch is under a lot less load. So spam ports tend to work a little better. You can, of course, put network taps in. However, the customer wishes, of course, for you to actually get in there and analyze some traffic. Now, what you analyze the traffic with can start to get a little interesting. So one of the approaches when we were talking to one of our customers actually was the Wireshark approach. So give your consultant a laptop, send them in with Wireshark, or simply ask the customer to run Wireshark on something suitable, and get them to sniff the required network through that spam port and capture the PCAPs. So you can save a couple of days, the odd week, into a range of PCAP files, and then of course you can send that to yourselves as the partner who's obviously providing the Defender for IoT demo, and then you can start to play around with those PCAPs to try and get some value out of them. So in these reduced travel budget days, this might be quite a nice way of actually getting some real data out of the customer that you can then start manipulating, and then obviously give a feedback report to them, which is individual, of course, to their environment. So it makes a POC or pilot far more impactful than just a standard product demo, which is pretty much what you're seeing now, of course, as we step through. That goes onto a laptop, and then from the laptop, this could be on the laptop itself. You can then replay those PCAPs into the sensor. So by default, if you've come from the CyberX world, I'm sure you'll be aware of Dell HPE machines that can come configured as sensors. It's based on some sort of Linux build. I can't remember which one, to be honest, but that allows, this is the standard setup, but it comes obviously as an ISO file from us. So if you want to, you can put it into Hyper-V or VMware, and of course you can run that on your laptop. So you can actually get a sensor running on your laptop. And because you've just got the PCAPs from the customer, if you go into the sensor, there's a little option to then replay those PCAPs, and it will feed the sensor all that packet information. And now at this point, of course, you can now go off and start doing some analysis on that data and see if there's anything interesting in that particular customer environment. So that little replay is just shown, obviously, by that little arrow there. And this is nice, and this is as far as some of our partners have got, actually, because this is the traditional approach. So A customer will have a range of these devices located around, depending where their network segments are, or their subnets, and where the switches, of course, exist as well. And the partners may, depending if they're connected, of course, a lot of the IoT environments aren't, or they say they're not, rather. And therefore, it requires a physical visit sometimes to extract some of the data from these. Or, as Richard mentioned, there might be a connection manager appliance as well, which can actually join together some of these sensors and provide a common interface. Now, you still need your subscription in the cloud, because that's where you'll get hold of the updates, for example, for these sensor boxes as well. Now, if they are completely disconnected, you'll need to load those updates onto your laptop, get in your car, go to site, link into the same subnet these things connected into, and then you start doing some of the update of those threat intelligence packages as and when they become available. We don't think they're on a schedule anymore. So it used to be roughly monthly. Now the threat intelligence packages are coming out when, as and when needed. So as they get developed, they're released the next day. There is no set sort of date per month when these are coming out anymore. And we'll go to why that's important in a few moments. And then, of course, if partners are managing multiple sensors or multiple management consoles, they'll probably end up feeding their own alert management platform. That could be some sort of SIEM. It could be some sort of automation into things like ServiceNow, for example. It doesn't really matter what it is, but there'll be some sort of alerting package that partners will then use to provide, obviously, the secured IoT environment service to their customers. Oh, and there is the management console, as a little reminder. Which reminds me of this part as well, of course. It's always good having a nice diagram. And one of the other methods we've seen some of the partners use is exactly this. So if a customer has multiple sensors and they do see a common network through one of the NIC cards connected on the back of these sensors, then they will all feed into a central management console, and that's what the partner can end up actually managing. So what we have seen quite often is some sort of remote desktop into this management console, so the partner can actually manage these sensors, disconnected still in a way, because you're not connecting directly to the sensors, you're going via the console. And of course, you're doing that through an RDP, some sort of Bastion host style box to allow that remote management to actually occur. Now, we suspect that's how it's been done a lot in the past with IoT partners. And of course, Microsoft has come in with its size 12s and started stomping around a bit. And it has its own ideas, of course, of how this may work in the future. And of course, from a product development perspective, what direction we're going to be taking this as well. So no matter what version you choose, whether it's a laptop being shuttled via a car to get into the set, to get connected to the sensors, via a management console, or through some of the other connections we're going to use in a moment, you'll always need a subscription per Defender for IoT. Now that subscription can of course occur in two places. And this is probably the most important part of this slide now as we get in. What partners seem to default to, because this is how they've always done it, is they'll own the subscription on behalf of their customers. Of course, they charge them appropriately as well. But the thing is that the partner subscription lives inside the partner tenant, and therefore it will all flow in quite nicely from that perspective. And this partner, of course, may have multiple customers, and therefore there'll be multiple sets of sensor information coming in to this particular partner subscription. Or they might be handling it this way still, and they just use their partner subscription, get the license files to actually activate these sensors. So if you do have a physical sensor or a hypervisor version of the sensor, you do need a licensed version. It doesn't take much effort actually just to download a bit of code from this particular portal, and that will license then the sensor for you. However, we have another approach, and that is, well, the problem with this one, of course, is then if you do have multiple partners and you are feeding into one partner subscription, how do you then actually identify or segregate between the different partners or different customers, sorry, if you're managing more than one? And that was an old age problem, of course, we had with Sentinel, which is our SIEM, as in central alerting product as well. So this is where we think we should be ending up. And of course, any comments or questions are always welcome. So we think the Defender for IoT subscription should be in the customer's subscription. That's inside the customer's Azure tenant. We also believe they should be running Sentinel. If appropriately, they should be running as MDE some reason the labels have gone missing. Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, and that's just the IoT Hub to show that it's being plumbed in at the background as well. And if a customer's running all of this, then the partner won't be far behind either in this brave new world. So the partner subscription has now moved from, forget this one down here, it's moved to up here, and the partner is now going to be running Sentinel as well. So it sounds like we've just turned this whole presentation into a Sentinel discussion or a Sentinel sales pitch almost. That's not quite what we're doing, because in reality, there's very little money involved in any of this. So we'll get to that in a moment. And we'll let this slide build, and then I'll go through the various explanations. And there is not technology as such. There's an ability in Azure called Azure Lighthouse, and it gives trusted parties the ability to read into particular environments. So in our language for today, that allows a partner to read into a customer's environment, which is all very nice. And what does this actually mean? So let's say your turbine all the way over here has developed a problem of some description with one of the sensors that exists. An alert has been raised, maybe a stop command has been sent. So it's been noted that something in one of these boxes or turbines even attempted an internet connection, maybe successfully attempted an internet connection, which should never be able to do. And therefore an alert has now been picked up by port span equals that traffic and is now held on this particular box here. Now, assuming it's all cloud connected, and I know that's a big assumption, but we are looking at the future from at least the Microsoft perspective, not just to emphasize, there will always be a disconnected version as well, because we realize those customers certainly exist in the OT space. But just to sort of let the minds wander into a future state, then those alerts will get fed into Azure Defender for IoT. That's now as part of that customer subscription. There is now a link between Defender for IoT and Sentinel, so you can pipe those alerts directly into Sentinel as well. Now, for those of you who don't know Sentinel, if you've never had the pleasure of talking to Richard and I before, then Sentinel's a fantastic product. Sits in the middle, collects alerts or security information from pretty much everything that goes on. Well, it used to be the IT world, but now, of course, the OT world. Now it has this connection into Defender for IoT as well. But basically, anything that emits any form of audit or let's see, well, basically any form of audit information, even down to things like syslog, for example, as well, can be fed into Sentinel, and then it can start to reason across all these alerts from all these different platforms and sources and environments and start dragging out some intelligence to provide a picture of what's going on within those customer environments. So the wind turbine device has got an issue, some description, there's of course some sort of alert. It's now effectively being fed into Sentinel as well. And this version of Sentinel sat on the customer site, by the way, we're still in the customer's tenant here. It's also looking at things at Azure Active Directory to see who's been logging in. It's looking at the Office 365 logs to see who's been accessing files on SharePoint or sending emails. It could be listening to your firewalls, your proxy servers, your Unix boxes, your Windows servers. Doesn't really matter. If you've got anything that produces some sort of audit stream, it can be fed into Sentinel. And then the lovely thing about Sentinel, then I will stop talking about it, is it can automate a lot of this as well. It can automate the sifting through all this data to find the interesting stuff. And then the really interesting stuff, where it starts to get really interesting, is it can then, once it detects something, however it's detected it, it can then start automating a response as well. Now, that's not quite so interesting in the IoT world as it is with firewalls, for example, because we can start automatically configuring firewalls if we had to, even on-prem based ones. But certainly, if we need to raise a ticket, for example, within ServiceNow, to get some sort of assembly line operator to go and check, the alert coming off from maybe a car robot that's developed a fault of some description, then of course we can raise a ticket in ServiceNow. That gets assigned to that local factory or that local assembly line, or when the next BOTEC goes out to some out at sea wind farm, then they've got a list, of course, of which ones they need to visit, all based off a bit of automation from there, or any other package. So Sentinel will talk to pretty much anything. Now that's all very nice, and we've got a nice environment all running here. As you'll come to see later, MDE talks into all of this as well, and so do other bits and pieces as well. So it provides a nice centralized view on security across the entire customer environment. As a partner up here, you'll need to run Sentinel as well as a first stage, as it were, and that then gives you access into the screens, if you like, into the dashboards. Customer will run a little script enabled Lighthouse, we will run it for them. And that gives you then the ability to open up your Sentinel and query their Sentinel. Now, the query runs from here. Well, the query is activated from here. It actually runs on the customer's Sentinel environment because that's where the data is stored. And then the query results are sent back to you. So if you want to query this customer, let's say this one is a wind farm one, you want to query to see, what state the turbines are in, perhaps, and see if there's been any security alerts on those turbines. And then you can query this particular Sentinel, and it'll come back and it'll show the results of that query in your Sentinel interface. So why is that interesting? It's interesting for two reasons, two primary reasons at least. One is you pay for Sentinel on ingestion only. Well, pretty much. I'm simplifying it slightly, but this is 99% of the story. Because we're not actually ingesting any data into this Sentinel, it's going to cost you virtually nothing to run. And in fact, if your customers are only using Sentinel, let's say, to monitor Defender for IoT and a few other base things, it's going to cost them incredibly little to run as well. So when I said this isn't a Sentinel sales pitch, it's because this may cost you $50 to $100 a month to give you an idea of some of the scaling involved. The actual ingestion of alerts for Defender for IoT is actually free, for example. It's actually free from MDE as well, for example, as well. It's not free for Azure AD, to be fair, but they're fairly low volumes generally as well. So when we talk about running Sentinel, I mean, there is the aspect, of course, of having to configure and manage and run the Sentinel architecture, but from a pricing perspective, it's very, very small. Compared, of course, to the $2,000 a month at the moment for IoT, it becomes almost a rounding error. So don't think this is money, this is ability or opportunity rather to actually reach out and start to manage multiple customers. Because the next step is, of course, you've got another customer and another customer. And I think we can go up to 15 or 20 customers before we even start to break sweat at the moment. So if you're managing multiple different customers and they've all got their own wind farms or factory floors, whatever it might be, you can start querying them all at once. You can write a single query to go off and see if that Siemens S7 stop command has been found anywhere else in all the customers you're managing. Now, perhaps you focus on verticals, perhaps you're in energy, perhaps in production, in farm, or whatever it might be. So some of these attacks are obviously individual or at least focused on those particular verticals as well. So that then gives us the ability, or gives you the ability rather, to start jumping in and actually running some queries across all your customers to see if anything's lighting up. Is it just that one customer being affected, or is it all your customers being affected? Is there some sort of blanket attack going out rather than a specifically targeted one? So that's the sort of thing that starts becoming possible. Now, I'll pause there. I have a tendency to monologue, and I'll just check to see if there's any questions, actually, because this is probably the most contentious part of this morning, or this afternoon, depending on where you are. Let's check my screen. Oh, we've got away quite lightly. Good. Right.
We have had a lot come in. There's been quite a few interesting questions, but we've answered them all. Much of it around this deployment, or things like Azure Sentinel is obviously now a new topic, and can it be deployed into multiple subscriptions? Can we do central monitoring for multiple customers? So yes, to all of that you can. I've put some answers in the questions for you, but yeah, any other questions, please feel free to keep adding them and we'll keep answering them. Carry on.
Thank you, Richard. So some highlights then from this slide before we leave it, because this took me ages to build, so we're going to have to spend some more time on it. Don't forget, you can use this as a cheeky approach to doing a proof of concept for customers. So if they don't want you on site, they don't want you connecting anything to any of their equipment because it's far too sensitive to allow anyone in, get them to capture some PCAPs. Now, just so happens that everyone appears to be using Wireshark. I'm sure there's other methods as well, but get them to produce the PCAPs, send them to you. You can then load them into whatever sensor you've got handy to you. It could be running on your laptop. It could be some spare server you've got knocking around that's got some sort of Linux build on. Can't remember, is it Ubuntu? I can't remember exactly which version. There's documents, of course, on our docs.microsoft.com on how to build out your sensor once you've got hold of that ISO image file as well. And then don't limit your thinking, I suppose, is what we're trying to say to the old ways of managing these boxes. Think if the customer is not adverse to a bit of cloud connectivity, and we do realize that's a huge if, or we like to think is a when. Slowly everyone's going to get cloud connected, of course, in our world. And what we are finding is there's a degree of truth in that as well. We go to quite a few customers and say, oh, well, is there any internet connection? Well, no, there's not. No, this is a very secure production facility. We're making COVID vaccines. That's not a real example, by the way. I'm making this one up. And therefore, we don't allow anything into this. You switch on the sensor, within 10 minutes, it's found some of these IoT devices talking to the internet. It's found within 20 minutes plain text passwords running around. Within about 30 minutes, we can always guarantee it's going to find some TeamViewer packets. And that's how they're actually remotely managing these sensors. Because, of course, everyone's been affected by the work from home. No one's really allowed to come into work, or haven't been until very recently. And therefore, lots of companies we found have sort of jumped a few steps in one go, as it were, to allow this remote work ability, especially as it finds out in the IoT space. And generally what we're finding is it's not these devices, of course, that are actually being targeted. It's these RDP or TeamViewer or whatever remote screen tools or remote assistance tools you happen to be using. So they're the big ones. I'm not sure I explained MDE very well, but I think we'll come on to that in one. No, I do come on to it. So we'll save that for the next half-hour slot. So we're running actually perfectly on time. So give me 2 seconds. I think we may need a new screen to show the next part. So, I'll just pause for a dramatic effect. All I'm actually doing is just looking at my other screen in reality.
And while you're doing that, Paul, I can maybe address one of the questions that came up about on-premises. So if your customers are reluctant to go to the cloud, again, it can be deployed on premises only, but they pay for it in Azure. So they set up the subscription, they set up the payments, they'll pay for it through Azure. They can then download all the files they need and run it completely offline. If they wanted to use Azure Sentinel, that is cloud only. So they could set up a one-way connector to send the data out to the cloud for monitoring and analysis and not have anything come back down. So you could at least do a one-way connector, but otherwise you are encouraging your customers to adopt some level of cloud modernization. And again, that is the challenge for the partner, is to move them forwards in modernization, which they are being forced to do by other factors anyway, such as their modern sensors and their other capabilities across the business that are enabling them, not holding them back from a security perspective, if you like.
No, very good point. Yes. And just to re-emphasize again, actually, just to make sure. So you do need an Azure subscription no matter what. But it doesn't mean the sensor has to be communicating with that Azure subscription. The Azure subscriptions needs to get the license file to activate those ISO files. So you will need a laptop that is connected to the cloud to download the license file, and then you can walk across to the disconnected network and then activate the sensor if it's in a very sort of remote off-net or dioded or whatever it might be sort of environment. We are finding that those environments are less and less though as we talk more and more. And to be fair, if you go back 15 years, well, not quite that long, 13 years, we had exactly the same issue with Office 365 and things like SharePoint and Exchange. So they were all operating on premise quite happily, and then we started pulling them into the cloud, and suddenly, everyone required cloud access or internet access to reach their email servers. So it feels like a similar journey starting again. So we've sort of gone back 1-2 decades almost in IT world at least to revisit some of these OT problems as we see. But Richard and I have worked with quite a number of the sort of government customers as well who work in some very protected spaces. And what they are finding is that sometimes they can't. So some sensors do have to stay very much disconnected and never see the light of an internet connection at all. But that's often quite a small proportion. You're talking a couple of % worth of the estate of what needs to be monitored. And then the pricing impact, of course, of having this all done through cloud and remote and as a managed service by a partner becomes a lot more attractive for those that don't need such a high degree of isolation, perhaps, than the rest of the estate. But it's a very individual conversation, and it very much depends, of course, on the customer's environment. Often people paying for it will have a bit more say than perhaps they used to. So inventory, always an interesting one. This took me ages to figure this one out. So what do you see? So some people in the audience might see a wind farm in the UK. If you see a wind farm in the UK, which we have quite a few now, then they max out currently about 200 turbines. Now, if you happen to be in China, for example, and looking at the world's largest wind farm, that's got about 7,000 turbines in. So when I look at this, I see roughly 150 IoT devices per turbine. So if you're in China, that one field is 1 million plus. And if you're one of the largest, well, UK-based ones at least, and there's also the equivalents around Europe and US as well, then we're looking between 30 and 50,000 devices that all need, obviously, of course, to be monitored. Wind turbines are quite a nice one, because especially at sea, because they get exposed to a lot of weather, a lot of waves, a lot of problems, which are then hence the rapid need for a lot of IoT devices to monitor things like vibration and gear temperature and all sorts of interesting areas, which is why each of them have got quite a large range of devices to see. Now, when we walk into customers in particular and say, well, how many IoT devices have you got? Well, actually, from practical experience, when we were talking about this on a call the other day, out of the entire team globally, only 2 people had walked into an environment that they were able to give them a spreadsheet of every single IoT device they owned. So one was a candy manufacturer or a sweet manufacturer, if you live in the UK. And the other one was one that relied on the sweet manufacturer, interestingly enough. I can imagine they must have been quite small. So as you get to obviously large, evolved companies that have grown over time through things like acquisitions and stuff, then going into someone like a large energy company or even a large pharmaceutical company, the chances of them knowing exactly what they've got connecting is pretty close to zero. So in many cases, the cost, no matter what it might be, I know there's a cost reduction coming in, but the cost of running any sort of IoT sort of secured environment is often can be justified through the inventory alone. If you've got a device that can sit on their networks, leave it there for a week, for example, come back and you've got an entire list of what actually exists on those networks and what they're connecting to. Hey, remember that old DSL link you put in for a particular partner 5 years ago? Well, guess what? No one actually remembered to switch it off. And that's why half of these turbines have been speaking to the internet quite happily, because one of the manufacturers of one of these components thought it might be fun to try and remotely update some of the firmware perhaps on some of these devices. So all these scenarios, of course, exist in the real world. Everyone's fallible to a degree. And therefore, if we can build up that inventory knowledge, this is one of the greatest things that Defender for IoT can actually give us.